Architect Divya Chakravarti. She completed her undergraduate studies from SRM University and she went on to pursue her master's in historic preservation and urbanism and study of the built environment from the University of California, Los Angeles. She went on to work for the Department of Planning and Preservation for the city of Pasadena, California. She also did a brief stint of work for Historic Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. She also worked on conservation projects like Kalsa Mahal, Gokhale Hall in Chennai, and Marimalappa Educational Trust in Mysore. She is currently working as a director of Samrakshan Heritage Consultancy. She is also a co-founder of the Artisan Reprisal of Traditional Materials, Method and Technology. She goes on to conduct workshops to revive traditional and lost methods of construction.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series for Bachelors of Architecture. The subject we are discussing is Evolution of Human Settlements. The fourth lecture will deal with historical periods and growth of human settlements. In this unit, we will be seeing medieval age settlements, Renaissance settlements, industrial age settlements. Now, looking into medieval settlements and the kind of villages and the principles of classification that emerged, if you look at it, the two key questions that we get about medieval settlement remain is when and why did villages become established? We have learned all this only because of archaeological excavations and work that has been happening since the 70s. But all these villages that we have seen have occurred and developed between the beginnings of 9th and 10th century AD and were in the peak of their development by the time we studied them. You have the basic shapes over here of the different villages. You have the irregular row plans, you have the regular row plans. This is the agglomeration where you have a cul-de-sac and then you have a kind of across the road agglomerated plans. So, what usually happens was you would have a road and then the town would develop with a regular pattern and then you have the irregular kind of pattern that happened with the dispersion that was not completely inorganic. You could actually see the natural way the town developed. Here you have the importance for greenery. This town, like you see over here, the lack of greenery is obvious. There is only the towns and the road. Here in Midridge, it is just the opposite. The presence of a green belt is what makes the town possible. Here again you see the very small presence of a green belt, but otherwise the town has completely proliferated. Again, absence of a green space, absence of a green space. So, greenery actually started becoming element of a village and towns recognize that we do not have to have much of a belt. So, again over here you have few elements and towns that have grown with a lot of greenery. Walbottle, Gamblesea and Grey Southern again with no spock of greenery at all. So, you had two concepts of towns that emerged with greenery and without greenery, and what they felt was the ones without greenery would aim to grow towards a larger town with greater expansion details. But what they fail to understand it is because of the green belt and the sense of a whole element of greenery or water attached to that town is why the town prospered. This is the composite or polyfocal plans, that is you had more than one nuclei. You had 1, 2 and 3 nuclei in this. Here again you have the importance of greenery given on both sides, but the town is developed heavily on one end. So, this is where the polyfocal and composite kind of plans come into being. So, what actually happened was this was completely an organic process of change. No one woke up one day and decided, okay, let us move in this direction, let us move in that direction. These were all changes that were made by the community, and most of these were rural reorganization. Where there was more greenery, it was obviously more agriculture oriented, versus the non-green towns could be service oriented towns or tradesman oriented towns. So, most analysis of settlement types and patterns has been morphological, that is, it has changed over a period of time, it has not emerged overnight. Documentary sources can add to this picture, but most medieval settlement formation took well before any sort of record keeping became the norm. So in 13th century, 14th century only records, drawings, all of that came into being. But the villages and towns we are talking about emerged way before that. So many villages had part-time or seasonal work outside agriculture. This was in terms of potting, iron making, extra activities like, woodland exploitation, where they would get wood from the forests. They would rear sheep for wool. They would get the animal skin. They would get the different animals as hunters for food. So all of this was the ancillary professions. And around the coast, obviously fishing. And all these things may leave visible archaeological remains in and around the settlement, but it is not necessary. Now again, if you look at this town, this is the town of Fareham Percy in North Yorkshire. This is based on a sketch that was found over there, but this is based on excavatory evidence which was there taken from a particular satellite. You can see there has been a kind of development because around the church and the manor house, this green forest area was very important. It's where all the timber for firewood and all came about. The excavation clearly shows the visible level of forest that occurs there even now. Here you can see the development of town that has happened. Here you see the center village space or the village square, which is now very prominent. So from the excavation details to the painting that was found of the place, it is actually supported by evidence and by the way of life of the people that hasn't changed much over the past few years. So while the investigation of standing buildings, especially vernacular houses, all that is obviously very important, but that cannot be taken as the only way of studying what actually gives the local and regional distinctive flavor. Now we move on to Renaissance settlements. So what are the new elements that came about in Renaissance and Baroque? Aesthetic determinants, aggrandizements, and urban scenery. So these are the three elements that were brought about. Aesthetic determination is new humanism ideas, that is, they started having elements just for the sake of having elements. It did not have to have a purpose. It was meant to appreciate beauty. Okay, this is a plaza where the town gathers. Let us put up a sculpture over here. Let's put some flowers or a garden around it so people can enjoy it. So the whole importance to beautification was very important. This is a typical plaza again. You can see the obelisk that was made. So the Renaissance was basically a cultural movement that happened right after the Dark Ages, roughly from 14th to 17th century. It began in Florence in the late Middle Ages. That is, in the sense, as the Dark Ages was coming to a conclusion, the Renaissance movement began in Florence, Italy, and then it spread to the rest of Europe. This term cannot be actually directly used because different parts of Renaissance took over in different parts of Europe at different parts of time. That's why it's from 14th century to 17th century, and this term covers all those time periods. So if you look at it as a cultural movement, it was a resurgence of learning. That is, when people refused to believe the feudal lords just at their face value. They wanted to understand their religion, understand culture, and question why everything was happening. So there was a perspective in painting, gradual educational reform, and this intellectual transformation resulted in the Renaissance being viewed as a gap between the Middle Ages and the modern era. So the Middle Ages where people were completely ignorant, and now the modern era is where people are completely overconfident. The Renaissance was a true time period of learning. So although Renaissance saw revolutions in many intellectual pursuits as well as social, political upheaval, because people protested against the feudal laws. They're like, why should there be a feudal lord? We can take care of ourselves. There were a lot of revolutions happening, a lot of wars happening. It is best known for its artistic developments and contributions of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, who inspired the term Renaissance man. They were the main thinkers and philosophers. Now, if you look at enclosement, what was the main reason this happened? This was because of growing and centralization of various autocratic political and economic powers, they wanted to make sure it was fortified. A castle was built, a gate was built. So such kind of things were happening. And urban scenery became very important because they wanted to start spending money on beautification. They decided, let's make the place beautiful. Economical capacity to promote complex urban operations. So it was very crucial. You can see the difference in a medieval settlement to that of a Renaissance settlement. It's more organized, it is more neat, clearly laid out and well defined, and nothing is completely left to organic chance or nature's chance. You have unifying buildings. This is the main plaza, and you can see a network of buildings that has formed, a roadway for horse carts, pathways for pedestrians. It was clearly demarcated and enclosed spaces were made. No more were places open-minded. The open spaces were itself enclosed, so there was a sense of security and guarding that could happen. Cannon-proof geometries. This was the next important development that happened. In the Renaissance stage, like we just mentioned, there were wars, there were a lot of revolutions, and as time progressed, there were new kinds of weapons. It was no more bows and arrows. They had cannons, they had cannonballs. So they started having new senses of geometry to protect themselves, as well as to make sure there were watchtowers to watch out for enemies who were coming. So this kind of geometry emerged in most urban planners, town planning, and most of the villages had fortifications resembling this shape because you could protect the inner building. This was a typical ground plan of a city which is inspired by the octagon. If you look at the octagon, it has 8 towers. The center you have the citadel, radiating streets of 16 odd streets, and here you have the watchtowers and the cannonball towers to protect themselves and their main citadel. These are ideal cities of Renaissance time that came about with a defense wall. Defense was given a lot of importance. This was all that happened in Italy. You have the La Sforzinda by Filaret. Filaret was a very important architect or urban planner at that point of time. Those titles didn't particularly exist at point of time. You have Giovanni of Verona who came up with a couple of them, but you can see what is a common factor amongst all these plans. It is the sense of step geometry. You had the access points defined. Octagon and hexagon played a very important role, and they were all radially situated, and if not radially situated, outwards they were octagon, so they can be linear in the center. So these were the typical plans of various Renaissance towns that was propagated to make sure all the palaces and forts could be protected. So it was during this period that architects began to systematically study the shaping of an urban space. How is it that an urban space comes into being, and just not as a building itself, but the entire city was given the status of a piece of architecture. So it has to be it has to be functioning well, it has to be aesthetically pleasing, it has to have great public spaces. Italian cities date from this era, most of the old Italian cities, and they were rebuilt to create elegant squares, long street vistas and symmetrical building arrangements. So once aesthetics and functionality came into being, a town got a new form by itself. And responding to the advances in firearms during the 15th century, new city walls were designed with large earthworks to deflect artillery and star-shaped points to provide defenders with sweeping lines of fire. You have the Spanish colonial cities in the New World which were built according to rules. So there were particular rules that were made. This is called the Laws of the Indies, 1573, which specifies the orderly grid of streets with a central plaza, what kind of defensive wall is required, so that there is a uniform building style emerging. Now if you look at the features of a Renaissance style, a new style of fortification of earthwork, bastions and artillery resistant wall developed. So it was very important that warfare had to be given importance. Yes, aesthetics was given importance, but functionality was also very crucial. Vast open spaces were left to the center of towns for community activities, but it was within the fortification. The open spaces could also be guarded. Great emphasis on elevation treatment of building roads can be seen. Trades brought the concentration of people to the town situated in the main crossroads. Owners of the land shifted to the merchants and the power of the feudal lords diminished. Printing press was invented and ways were devised to improve simple hand machines. Gunpowder was invented in 15th century and therefore new techniques of warfare were introduced, which changes the strategies, and all fortifications became redundant and inadequate. New kinds of walls and fortifications were required. The contrast between the rich merchants and the poor increased, so there was an insecurity of life amongst the poor. So there was a feeling of unrest even within the town. So even the palace had to be protected, even the rich merchant's house has to be protected against the poor people who would attack them. As a result of religion becoming more important, exhibitionism, that is the towers, the soaring towers, the cathedrals, the basilicas, all of that, they began the construction of a formal and monumental buildings to show off that kind of style that emerged. So, two types of manifestations are noticed in this period. You have new towns which were found, in which the central and the most dominating buildings were that of the nobles, that is the kings. For example, the Versailles in France, Canberra in Australia, and Washington DC in USA. And other major parts of London was designed by Christopher Wren, following this very example. In the old medieval towns that existed, development was done in public congregation places like squares, piazzas or plazas. So, in Italy it was referred to as piazza. So, you had the Piazza of St. Mark's, Venice, then you had the Piazza of St. Peter's, and then you have the Piazza del Popolo in Rome and Place des Victoires in Paris. So, all of these also gained importance. So, number one, you had the importance of the castle, and then you had the importance of the plaza for the common man. Now, we come in from the Renaissance to the Baroque, which is a later part of Renaissance. So, here what happened was the axial system of planning, which was introduced by Lorenzo Bernini. This happened during the Renaissance period. It was developed during the Baroque period. King Louis XIV ordered to remove from his palace the congested Paris to a more open and open space in Versailles, and that's where the new plan of, according to the Baroque kind of planning, emerged. So, what happened over here is, after Napoleon III came to power, the cities became congested with slums. Lot of people moved from so-called agricultural land to the trading land because they thought it made sure they had more money. So, that was a kind of urbanization that happened at that point of time. So, Paris basically started crumbling and deteriorating. So, the king himself did not want to live there. He wanted to move out. So, mechanical traffic was to be introduced on the roads. It was urgent necessary to check the haphazard growth of Paris. So, instead of repairing it, he decided to leave and go to the Baroque style of architecture that developed in Versailles in Paris. So, George Eugene Haussmann was the main guy who came up with the Baroque city kind of development, where you had straight avenues, geometry was given importance, axes and fountains. So, these are the four main features of Baroque planning. Of course, there were some height restrictions that were introduced, boulevards were made, vistas were given importance, that is, views from this particular roads were given importance. So, in terms of Versailles in France, what actually happened? Saint Louis XII ordered Leonard to design the gardens of Versailles. The spaces created were unparalleled proportion and beautiful in size. So, it was both a combination of colonnades and entrance lined by avenues. So, colonnades was from the Renaissance period and the avenues was an introduction of the Baroque style. Star-shaped fortification, obviously, which we discussed, was very important, and then you have a central core which was considered the ideal city. So, Renaissance designers froze the streets which radiated from the center. So that was what was done in that point of time. All the roads lead to the center of the town towards the palace, and plazas were open and less confined in the countryside. So what was the difference between Paris and Versailles? They basically reduced the congestion, but they did not want to make it completely security free. So the star-shaped fortification still existed, but they made the plazas more open and all the roads led to the palace. So we basically associate the Baroque city with the emergence of many states between 1600 and 1750. You have ambitious monarchs who came up with new palaces, courts, and many administrative offices. The grand scale was sought in urban public spaces, long avenues, radial street networks, monumental squares, geometric parks and gardens, and Versailles is a clear expression of the city building model, and in the United States it was Washington DC. So both of these were an expression of the Baroque style of town planning. So if you look at the Baroque principles, they were done completely by Baron Haussmann, and it was in his way of restructuring Paris that happened. It was a beautiful accident that happened in the place. His job was to basically come up with another town in Versailles, but he came up with an entire new town planning type. He carved a new thoroughfare through the tangled web of the Parisian streets, making sure the major sub-centers are linked to the city so that people can travel and commute. So that was the beginning of the first suburban city. So that was the first step to what we refer to as suburbanization. To conclude, we see that in the medieval period, the main emphasis was given to mass of the buildings. In the Renaissance period, the importance was given to space, but it was truly only in the Baroque period that the importance was laid upon both mass as well as space. Now we will move on to industrial age settlements. What actually happened after the Renaissance time is constantly people were going forward. There was no more looking back. There was a time of inventions, it was a time of education, it was a time where culture was at its peak. So as we are talking about invention, it was the beginning of the industrial revolution on the human settlement. The main pocket of industrial revolution was around about here, and we see a lot of development happen around that point of time. It refers to this profound influence of new developing science and technologies. Began in the 1870s, so production, commerce, trade and distribution of goods expanded rapidly. So dependence shifted from renewable resources to non-renewable resources. New machines were then created and large-scale production became prevalent. More food and supplies became available, so population began to grow rapidly. What political aspect, what happens is the crown declines. The power of the king actually became lower. The merchants and the tradespeople, the nobles also decline. The industrial entrepreneurs emerge as powerful bodies. Merchants and traders became the new age kings. Administration becomes difficult because as industries increase, population increases, towns increase, the density of population increases, and that was the beginning of colonization. Because they were looking for people to work for them, they started to travel. The steam engine was invented, the ships were set out to bring in people to work, trade routes were discovered, trade routes were beginning, and all of this was happening in the political aspect. Geographically, what happened is newly productive industrial areas opened up in areas which are not necessarily good for agriculture. So different patterns of settlement actually start, and a sense of regional planning came into being. It was no more city, town, it was even more focused. Now we will come on to the effects of industrial revolution. Here we can just see how it began with the invention of the steam engine. Mechanical power became independent of hand operation. Because of that, entrepreneurs applied this power to increase the production at a very fast rate, and because of that, it led to the increased production of goods, trades increased and expanded. As a result of that, Mass production made it possible for more people to have more things. A sense of commercialization began at that point of time. Capitalism of industrial system started. Number of employees in proportion to owners increase. With increased trading, the shop moved from home into a shop garter. So till then, trading happened within a residential area. It was just a separate building. But now with the Industrial Revolution, a proper industry was set up away from the city, and based on that, a shopping area was required or a market area was required. The factory became a magnet, drawing more number of young men and women for work. A new need was felt for an ever-increasing number of workers' dwellings, schools and shops. And as population increases, you have to feed that population. You have to make sure that population is supported by dwelling units, schools, shops and their standard of living. Then you have traffic congestion that is parallel in the increase of population density. As people increase in an area, obviously the traffic congestion in that area increases. So this ended up being like the cyclic chain of events that led to the decrease on standard of living in a particular town. What happened to public health and safety? Measures for public health and safety were extended during the 19th century. By then it became terrible. There was lack of sanitation, there was overcrowding, children were dying. Again, initially the benefits of Industrial Revolution were being reversed. The first system of water supply by gravity flow was installed, pumping systems were in general use, and methods for disposal and treatment of sewage as well improved. What happened initially with the Industrial Revolution is, as production increased, those elements could be applied even to agriculture, or even food increased. So drought, all those conditions was not there, famine was in there, there was adequate food, but everyone decided that the factories paid more, let's go there. But because of congestion and working in a factory surrounded by coal and the smoke emitting by these factories, health completely declined. The people's health was completely gone, sanitation was gone, water supply was insufficient, so it was basically very bad conditions of living, and again the mortality rate increased. The heavy buildings cover on the land reduced the natural drainage of the city, so it was not sufficient. But extensive street paving permitted effective cleaning, and strong sewers augmented the sanitary requirement. Common use in the street side were the lamps. Electricity began to replace gas for street lighting. So safety also became an issue at that point of time. Advantages: services for health, safety and convenience of the urban population advanced. Glorification of the industrial system and the fruits of its newborn activity blinded the people to ruin havoc and spreading across the urban community. Disadvantages: public health became obsolete in the sense it was not sufficient, diseases were becoming rampant, problems both economic and political emerged. So the factory town and a city emerged for the first time. The steam railroad made sure this happened, and the amenities of the urban life were sacrificed to the requirements of the industrial production. So people were sacrificed, the city was sacrificed, and everything relation to this was getting down the drain in terms of mortality rates, in terms of the standard of living of people. At the end of this lecture, we have covered medieval settlements and discussed the beginning of industrial age settlements. With the conclusion of this lecture, we should be able to answer the following questions. What are the planning concepts of a Renaissance city? Who developed the Baroque style of planning, and how was it different from the Renaissance style? What were the advantages and disadvantages of Industrial Revolution with respect to planning? That brings us to the conclusion of this lecture. Thank you.